Hi, I'm Amy Goodman. This year, Democracy Now! Is celebrating our 25th anniversary. That's a quarter of a century of bringing you the voices and stories you won't hear anywhere else. Democracy Now! Has always refused to take government or corporate funding because nothing is more important to us than our editorial independence. But that means we rely on you, our audience, for support. Please visit democracynow.org right now to make your contribution and help us stay on the air for at least another 25 years. Thank you so much. Oh, and remember, wearing a mask is an act of love. Wearing two is even better. From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We may have won the war tonight, but the battle is not over. We will continue to fight and speak out against those measures that attempt to silence our voices. They don't want you to know the truth on that bill. They don't want you to know how they don't want to see you at the polls. They don't want you to know that you have rights.
Democratic lawmakers in Texas stage a dramatic walkout Sunday night to prevent Republicans from passing a sweeping voter suppression bill. We'll go to Texas to speak with a leading Democratic state lawmaker. Then we look at the severe undercounting of deaths of people of color by law enforcement.
People of color are being killed at even greater numbers and higher rates than has been reported. We found 6,000 cases that are unknown, so we expect to find many more cases.
And we go to Canada, where the bodies of 215 children have been found on the grounds of a former residential school where Indigenous children were sent after being forcibly separated from their families by the Canadian government.
These poor children, they died alone and they died scared. And they're not the only ones that are hidden in graves all over Canada due to the Canadian government and the church's running of residential schools. And the same behavior that led to that is still going on now. Canada is still discriminating against First Nations children.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Texas, Democratic lawmakers staged a dramatic walkout Sunday night to prevent the Republican-controlled legislature from passing a sweeping bill to rewrite election laws in Texas. Critics say the bill will lead to mass voter suppression, especially of Black and Latinx voters, by eliminating drive-through and 24-hour voting, as well as ballot drop boxes. The Republican bill would also make it easier for elections to be overturned, even if there's no evidence of fraud. Just before the state's legislative session ended, Texas House Speaker Dade Phelan announced the bill had failed because there were no longer enough lawmakers present to reach a quorum. After headlines, we'll go to Texas for the latest. Peru's government has admitted its COVID-19 death toll has nearly triple the number previously reported. Peru's new official toll of 180,000 deaths makes it the country with the highest per capita COVID death rate in the world. Malaysia's entered a 2-week nationwide lockdown as cases surge in Southeast Asian countries that had successfully tamped down the spread of COVID-19. Vietnam's begun mass testing and will limit public gatherings after a surge that officials are blaming on a new, highly transmissible coronavirus variant. China's Guangdong province has ordered lockdowns after a sudden spike in cases. In Geneva, officials at the World Health Organization called Monday for a new international treaty on pandemic preparedness. WHO Emergencies Director Mike Ryan said that in the fight against emerging diseases, pathogens have the upper hand.
They sicken and kill us and disrupt every aspect of our lives. They exploit our interconnectedness. They expose our lack of coordination, our lack of solidarity, our societal inequities. In short, the pathogens are winning this fight right now, and that should not be the status quo, and it should not be something we accept.
In Brazil, tens of thousands of protesters marched in over 200 cities and towns Saturday demanding the impeachment of the far-right President Jair Bolsonaro. Brazil continues to average more than 60,000 new coronavirus infections each day, with an official death toll of 460,000. The protest came as Brazil's Senate continues a high-profile inquiry into Bolsonaro's catastrophic handling of the pandemic and his government's slow rollout of vaccines. Joining Rio de Janeiro's protest was Monica Benicio, whose fiancé, Marielle Franco, was murdered in 2018 by hitmen with close ties to the Bolsonaro family.
It's a duty to fight for democracy. This government is of no use to us. It doesn't serve the people, and its political project is to kill us. We have taken to the streets because we have no alternative.
In Colombia, right-wing President Ivan Duque deployed over 1,000 troops to the city of Cali over the weekend in response to ongoing massive anti-government protests. Duque reportedly ordered some 7,000 soldiers to be sent to Cali and other regions in the coming days. On Friday, tens of thousands of people took to the streets across Colombia to mark 1 month since massive mobilizations began in late April, initially triggered by a now withdrawn tax reform. Protests have continued against Duque's policies, skyrocketing poverty and police violence in Colombia. On Friday, at least 13 people were reported dead in the city of Cali alone. China's government is relaxing reproductive limits to allow married couples to have up to 3 children. It's the biggest change to China's population control laws since the lifting of the one-child policy in 2016. A recent census showed a rise in the proportion of elderly people in China as the birth rate continues to fall, triggering fears a shrinking labor force and aging population could damage China's economy. The Canadian government's facing pressure to declare a national day of mourning after the bodies of 215 children were found in British Columbia on the grounds of a school for Indigenous children who were forcibly separated from their families by the government. The bodies were discovered at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which opened in 1890 and closed in the late 70s. The Catholic Church ran the school up until 1969. We'll have more on the story later in the broadcast. Israeli opposition parties are nearing agreement on a governing coalition that would bring an end to Benjamin Netanyahu's 12-year term as prime minister. On Sunday, his chief rival, Yair Lapid, said he would work to form a national unity government with ultra-nationalist leader Naftali Bennett. The news came as Netanyahu hosted Egypt's spy chief in Jerusalem for talks on cementing a May 21st ceasefire that capped Israel's 11-day assault on the Gaza Strip. The bombardment killed 256 Palestinians, including at least 66 children, and displaced more than 70,000 Gazans. Here in the United States, thousands gathered in Washington, D.C. on Saturday for the National March for Palestine. This is Amani Barakat of Al-Awda, the Palestine Right to Return Coalition.
Who among us today feels the liberation of Palestine is closer than ever? Do you think it's time for Israeli settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, military occupation, and Gaza's blockade to be dismantled?
In Florida, at least 21 people were injured and 2 dead early Sunday when 3 gunmen opened fire on a concert venue in Miami-Dade County. Surveillance video shows the 3 hooded and masked suspects rushing out of a stolen SUV with assault rifles and handguns. They opened fire indiscriminately on the crowd, some of whom fired back at them before fleeing the scene just seconds later. Their SUV was found Monday submerged in a canal, and the suspects remain at large. According to the Gun Violence Archive, the U.S. saw over 200 mass shootings in the first 132 days of 2021. House Democrats are planning to convene a select committee to investigate the January 6th insurrection after Senate Republicans succeeded in stonewalling a bill that would have created a bipartisan commission to probe the Capitol assault. Just 6 Senate Republicans joined Democrats Friday in a Senate vote to break a Republican-led filibuster. That prompted some Senate Democrats to renew their calls to eliminate the filibuster. But other Democrats, including Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, remain opposed, while Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is has not endorsed eliminating the filibuster. Meanwhile, ex-President Trump's former national security advisor, General Michael Flynn, called Sunday for a military coup d'etat to overthrow the U.S. government, similar to the February coup in Burma that killed hundreds of people. Flynn's a former Army general who was pardoned by Trump for lying to the FBI. He was speaking at a weekend conference in Dallas, convened by QAnon conspiracy theorists and other Trump supporters. Flynn fielded a question from an audience member who identified himself as a Marine.
I want to know why what happened in Myanmar can't happen here.
No reason. I mean, it should happen here. No reason. That's right.
Michael Flynn now denies he was endorsing a coup. He also said that President Trump won the election and the Electoral College vote. Arizona prison officials have revived a decades-old gas chamber and are planning to use hydrogen cyanide, the same deadly gas used by Nazis at Auschwitz and other extermination camps, to kill people on death row. That's according to documents obtained by The Guardian, which show Arizona's Department of Corrections spent over $2,000 buying ingredients for the gas. The department has also refurbished a gas chamber at a prison in the town of Florence that was built in 1949 and hadn't been used in over 2 decades. In Philadelphia, a black man who spent nearly 3 decades behind bars for a crime he says he did not commit was released from prison Friday after District Attorney Larry Krasner's office said he had not received a fair trial. Eric Riddick was convicted of murdering his childhood friend in 1992 and sentenced to life in prison based on the testimony of a single eyewitness who recanted the testimony in a 1999 affidavit. An investigation by a firearms expert in 2012 ruled out the possibility that Riddick could have been the shooter. Riddick won his release after agreeing to plead guilty to a lesser third-degree murder charge. Illinois state lawmakers have passed a bill barring officers from lying to children during police interrogations. The first in the nation legislation prohibits the use of false promises of leniency and false claims about the existence of incriminating evidence when police are questioning people younger than 18. A lawsuit filed by an imprisoned anti-fascist activist alleges guards at the McCreary Federal Prison in Kentucky allowed white supremacist gang members to beat him in 2018. Eric King is currently serving a 10-year sentence for throwing Molotov cocktails at an empty building in Kansas City, Missouri in 2014 amidst Black Lives Matter protests. King says he's been targeted by over 40 correctional officers across multiple facilities throughout his imprisonment. He's been held in solitary confinement for over 1,000 days and now faces an additional 20 years to his sentence for allegedly assaulting a federal officer, which King says was in self-defense. In a statement published by The Intercept, King says, quote, "I'm a human being with a family. I've been treated deplorably, denied access to my family and my lawyers, and subjected to physical and emotional torture. They've done this because of my beliefs, not because of my actions," he said. And tennis superstar Naomi Osaka has withdrawn from the French Open after revealing she suffered from long bouts of depression since 2018. Osaka was fined and threatened with disqualification after she declined to take part in press conferences due to their effect on her mental health, she said. Sports researchers estimate 1/3 of athletes suffer from a mental health crisis at some point in their careers. Prominent athletes of color have come forward to support Osaka, from Steph Curry to Venus and Serena Williams. Osaka, who is a Japanese mother and a Haitian-American father, is a 4-time winner of Grand Slam tennis tournaments. She drew headlines last year when she wore the names of black victims of police brutality on her face masks on the sidelines of the U.S. Open. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
We begin today's show in Texas, where Democratic lawmakers staged a dramatic walkout Sunday night to prevent the Republican-controlled legislature from passing a sweeping bill to rewrite election laws in Texas. Critics say the bill would lead to mass voter suppression, especially of Black and Latinx voters, by eliminating drive-through and 24-hour voting, as well as ballot drop boxes and voting on Sunday. The Republican bill would also make it easier for elections to be overturned, even if there's no evidence of fraud. Just before the state's legislative session ended, Texas House Speaker Dade Phelan announced the bill had failed because there were not enough lawmakers present to reach a quorum.
There are 86 ayes, 0 nays. The motion to excuse fails for lack of quorum.
Speaker.
Mr. Tindall, for a purpose.
Parliamentary inquiry.
Please state your inquiry.
We take an oath at the beginning of session, and we collect per diem per day to be here on the House to do our job on behalf of almost 30 million Texans. Am I seeing that we don't have a quorum, and essentially it looks to me like the Democrats left the House floor and they're neglecting their duty that they swore an oath to do?
Mr. Tindall, that's not a proper parliamentary inquiry. Not every person left the floor is part of a party or not.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The election bill could still be revived if Texas Republican Governor Greg Abbott convenes a special session. Abbott has already threatened to veto a portion of the state budget used to pay lawmakers following the walkout. Many of the Democratic lawmakers who walked out gathered at the Mount Zion Baptist Church, a black church about 2 miles away. This is State Representative Nicole Collier, the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus.
We may have won the war tonight, but the battle is not over. We will continue to fight and speak out against those measures that attempt to silence our voices. They don't want you to know the truth on that bill. They don't want you to know how they don't want to see you at the polls. They don't want you to know that you have rights.
On Saturday, President Biden condemned the Texas legislation as un-American, saying, quote, "It's part of an assault on democracy that we've seen far too often this year and often disproportionately targeting black and brown Americans." Speaking after the walkout, Texas State Representative Trey Martinez Fisher called on the president to do more.
Mr. President, we need a national response to federal voting rights. Make no mistake, voting is fundamental. It does not know your color. It does not know who you love. It does not know your zip code. But it is our constitutional right, it is our God-given right to exercise our right to vote. And SB 7 would deny that right to many law-abiding Texans simply because there are those who only wish to play gotcha politics with legislation. And you only have to look at the way they have tried to pass this bill. They try to just ram it down our throats.
That was Texas State Representative Trey Martinez Fisher speaking with other Democrats after the walkout. He joins us now from San Antonio. Welcome to Democracy Now! Can you lay out the scene on Sunday night, why you all walked out, and what this bill represents, what it includes?
Well, good morning, Amy. Yes, Sunday night was a very emotional day as the President of the United States put the eyes of the nation on Texas, calling SB 7 un-American. And really, when you get down to it, this is going to have a tremendous impact on voters, all voters in the state of Texas. But just like every bad policy, Hispanics, Latinos, and Asian Americans will be disproportionately impacted. And so as we sort of came to a head at that Sunday evening, members of the African American caucus, the Black caucus, or Hispanic caucus, we came together behind a closed door and we met as a family, and we really just had a very emotional conversation, and we understood the consequence of this bill, and we also recognized the duty that we had to defend our constituents. And we made the decision right then and there that we would use the nuclear option. We had all tools in our toolbox, but if they intended to stop this debate, if Republicans intended to silence our voices, we knew that we can use the power of the quorum to walk out and not only speak to these Republicans for the way they are handling this bill in the Texas legislature, but we want to wake up the nation to understand that if you're going to go to Georgia and silence voters and then move to Florida and silence their voices, once you steamroll us here in Texas, Republicans will march all across this country and take away people's right to vote. And this is time The time is now for a national response, and that's why we have humbly asked the President of the United States, we've asked our United States Congress, we need a For the People Act. We need a John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We need a national response, and we need it now.
And Representative Martinez, I wanted to ask you, in terms of the demographic changes, for people across the country to understand the importance of Texas and expansion of voting rights there, the state currently is about 58% people of color, 40% Hispanic, 13% Black, 5% Asian. What would it mean for Texas to have full participation of all of its residents in voting? What would it mean at the national level in terms of politics?
Well, Juan, it's a game changer. I mean, you just hit the nail on the head. I mean, we have the largest African-American population in the country, one of the largest Latino populations in the country. That's significant. You know, we always said that SB 7, this voter suppression bill, is a solution looking for a problem. There is a problem out there, Juan, and the problem is Texans are voting. The problem is we are voting, but we're not voting for Republicans. And so, you know, knowing what they know, they have made a decision to put a target on our backs, silence our voices, so that they can maintain that grip on power. I mean, it's ironic that we celebrated Memorial Day yesterday to honor soldiers who go defend freedom and democracy around the world. But yet when those soldiers come home to Texas, they cannot go to their church, participate in their faith, and then leave to go vote, because Senate Bill 7 would eliminate the Souls to the Polls program by limiting the time you could vote on a Sunday. And that's a shame.
And isn't Texas also the state that gave birth to the Southwest Voter Registration Project? Willie Velasquez, who was the prime voting rights advocate of the Mexican-American community. And could you talk about that legacy, that Texas has more Hispanic officials, elected officials, than any other state in the country?
You know, listen, you're warming my heart this morning. I mean, Willie Velasquez, I live in the same neighborhood that he lived in. You know, Matt Garcia, Congressman Henry B. Gonzalez. I mean, San Antonio has always had a birthplace for civil rights and social justice, and we've worked in partnership with African Americans and to have a strong and proud minority voice. And really, you know, it's really those teachings that brought us in a room with senior Democrats. And so I convened what we called the Black and Brown Summit, along with State Representative Sempronia Thompson, who is, you know, the longest serving member Democrat in the House. We call her the mother of the House, as well as Representative Yvonne Davis, an African-American from Dallas. And we came together as senior members to say, you know what, this is the Rubicon that we need to cross, and we need to have a family discussion to live up to the legacy of the people who were there before us to stand up and do what's right for our constituents.
Representative Trey Martinez-Fisher, can you talk about Greg Abbott saying he's calling for a special session? He didn't even do that during the massive storm with the total electricity, failure. But he's going to do that for this. And what does this have to do with the election for governor in 2022?
Well, the campaign season's already it's already began here in Texas, and I think this is part of the script, part of the narrative. The governor threatening a special session. You're right. Did not call a single special session for COVID and the response to COVID. Of the 10 largest mass shootings in the country, 4 of them were in Texas. The governor didn't bring us back to deal with that. And then you're talking about Hurricane Harvey. You're talking about Winter Storm Uri that gave 4.5 million people no electricity in their homes, 15 million people without water. And yet he wants to bring us back to play politics. That's his prerogative. That tells me that he sees something in the polls that makes him a little nervous with his Republican base. But you're not going to play politics on the backs of Hispanics and African Americans. We will do everything in our power to stand up for our right to vote and to stand up for our constituents.
At the same time that you had your walkout on Sunday this weekend was the QAnon conference in Dallas, where former General Michael Flynn spoke and said there should be a military coup, though he denies that now, but it's on tape, and also said Trump won the election and the Electoral College vote. This is the atmosphere in Texas right now. And what are you going to do if there is a special session? What are Democrats going to do?
Well, the same rules we have in the regular session apply in the special session, a quorum being one of them. We have been behind the closed door for 140 days. We are a citizen legislature, so people have jobs, people have families. And so, when you time that session, you better hope that you're going to have full attendance, because if you don't have a quorum, you can't meet. And then number two, there are lots of items on the table when it comes to how we engage in debate, how we use the use of parliamentary procedure. SB 7 is an ugly voting rights bill. It had a counterpart in the House, in House Bill 6. Texas Democrats were able to take the sharp edges off of House Bill 6 and to push forward a policy that wouldn't put people in jail, and it wouldn't suppress the vote as severely as Senate Bill 7. I hope cooler heads prevail and that we can get in a room and talk. But if people don't want to talk, we're prepared to fight. And I hope you'll maintain a close eye on the deliberations once we go back to special session.
And Representative, I wanted to ask you about another issue. In recent news from Texas, Governor Greg Abbott is expected to sign a recently passed bill which would allow Texans to carry handguns openly in public without a permit. You talk about that?
Yeah, I guess it's going back to the days of the Wild West. There is just this notion that it's impossible to get a license to carry a concealed weapon. This is just part of the same culture politics that Republicans want to come to session. They don't want to deal with the winter storm. They don't want to deal with the fact that we have the highest uninsured population in the country. They don't want to govern responsibly, but they want to come up and talk about how to suppress the vote, how to promote, anti-abortion legislation. And they also want to talk about how you can just carry your gun just about anywhere. And so, listen, this is what we call part of the silly season of politics. Nobody is against responsible gun ownership. But the fact that the law enforcement community in the state of Texas was unanimous about we cannot have people walking around the streets with weapons and limiting our right to ask questions, is just another sign of what Republicans want to concentrate on, which is, nothing that average Texans care about.
And finally, you're calling on Biden to do more. You've got this issue of eliminating the filibuster. Manchin and Sinema, next door to you in Arizona, Senator Sinema, saying they don't want it eliminated. This would also mean a protection of voting all over the country. Your final comment.
What we have seen in the past, whenever we have a unified Congress and administration, time is limited. And so we need to put our priorities and put them at the forefront. I have seen a number of discussions about how you can eliminate or limit the filibuster. And I certainly hope, Senator Sinema would know in her state of Arizona, state law put a citizenship requirement on Arizona voters, and they saw a tremendous drop in voter turnout with Latinos. This is what's happening across the country, and we need a national response. This is the time to not think about our local politics or what bothers us as an individual. We need to think about what brings us together as a country. And bringing us together as a country is to make sure that every American, regardless of their color, regardless of who they love, regardless of where they live, they ought to have a right to vote without being bothered or pestered or having suppression tactics thrown in their face. And so with all due respect to Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, it is time to have a national response to federal voting rights.
Texas State Representative Trey Martinez-Fisher, a Democrat representing San Antonio, joined other Democrats in walking out of the Texas State Legislature Sunday night and stopping a voter suppression bill from being passed, at least for now. We'll continue to cover what happens. Coming up next, we look at the severe undercounting of deaths of people of color by law enforcement. Stay with us.
Caras posibles, tú me las quitas todas. Tengo una risa con alas que vuela si estamos a solas. Tengo una voz y una piel que quieren que tú las descifres. Tengo la vida muy corta para entender lo que dicen tus ojos, que cuando los miro brillan igual que los míos, pero no logro entender de qué van. Pero si un día tú me encuentras y ahora piensas diferente, te guardo un poquito de fe para abrir los ojos y verte. Pero si un día tú me encuentras y ahora piensas diferente, te guardo mi luz de mañana, mis ojos, mi amor y mi almohada.
debut by Silvana Estrada. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. A major new report on police killings suggests far more people of color have been killed by police than previously known. The report by the Raza Database Project and Unidos US found at least 2,600 Latinos were killed by the police since 2014. A figure 24% higher than previous counts. Overall, researchers documented the deaths of over 32,000 people who've been killed by police since 2000. People of color accounted for 60% of the deaths, despite making up roughly just 40% of the population. We're joined right now by Roberto Rodriguez, the director of the Raza Database Project, a network of some 50 researchers, scholars, journalists, activists, and family members of victims killed by law enforcement. He's also a professor at the University of Arizona and the author of several books, including Yolki, on police violence in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, and Justice, A Question of Race, where Roberto Rodriguez details his own experience after a brutal beating at the hands of L.A. sheriffs in March of 1979. Professor, thanks so much for joining us. First, lay out what you found.
Well, I've been researching this in '79, and I myself was surprised. We found many more killings than expected. We didn't even include the Border Patrol killings, which is about 128 in the last 10 years. We'll include that in the final report. But what we found is that there is no systematic effort to count, to collect this data. The FBI is supposed to, but they don't. It's up to the media and independent researchers. It's very difficult. But regardless, again, we combined about 5 different databases and found those 32,000 plus. I'm going from memory. I think the Black community suffers from about over 6,600 killings since 2000. The Latino or the brown population is about 5,700. The Asian community about 3,000, and the Native community over 500. Proportionately, the Native community actually is the highest. But something that's very important to note, it's not really the percentages that's the most important here, it's the number. Because, in other words, what if we were killed at the 40% rate instead of 60? Believe me, it would not be acceptable, because we're still talking those same numbers, and it's through the roof. And I think one of the other important things, aside from what we found, is that there were 6,000 cases of unidentified, unknown. And much of it often is when the police say no information available, and they do not release it like the same day, the next week, sometimes a few weeks later, sometimes a few months later, other times never. That complicates our research, and that's why we're going to, in between now and the release of the final report, which will be at the end of the summer, we're going to track down those 6,000 cases as best as we can. The thing to remember, it's not going to be the most accurate thing in the world, but it's going to be more accurate than what exists now. That's why I emphasize this shouldn't be up to us. This should be the government that requires every law enforcement agency to report. They don't. They never have. I think that's the most poignant aspect of this. It's like everything's normalized. It's taken for granted. In Europe, more Latinos are killed in this country than all of Europe combined. More African Americans are killed than all of Europe combined. That's unacceptable completely.
And Roberto, I wanted to ask you, looking at these figures, which are really astounding, it seems that on average, every day in America, at least one Latino and one African American is killed in either in the custody of police or through shootings. Could you talk about your decision to include those deaths in custody as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it answers itself. If they're under, it's like Sandra Bland, for example. She was under custody of officers. So if somebody's in a jail or in the police car, we have cases where somebody shoots themselves when they're handcuffed in the back of the car, and they shoot themselves in the front. I mean, in other words, and they claim that's a suicide. No, so we have to claim any death where the responsibility lies with the officers. There's even cases we did not include, and we're going to. We have to. All the people that die along the border, they're not there. They don't die accidentally. We have the documentation where the government says they drove people or they drive people into the desert so they can die. And that way it'll discourage people from coming through. How do you not include that? How do you not include a border patrol that makes it policy to chase people, cars overturned, 10 people die, etc.? It's even bigger than what we're talking about, And then again, it's all about dehumanization. And I'm not exaggerating when I say I track this violence to 1492, which means when Europeans came here, they decided that the people here, like myself, that we were not human. Africans that were brought here also were not human, according to them. In my opinion, it's the same dynamic taking place today. Otherwise, we wouldn't see this massive amount of both the killings and the disparity.
And in terms of the tremendous explosion in numbers, especially among Asian Americans and Native Americans that you found when you began to go into that other category. Could you talk about that as well?
Yes, well, it was accidental. So there's three categories that we weren't looking at in the past. We were just looking at, like Washington Post is the standard. The Guardian used to be, but they stopped, But the Guardian has, or rather the Post has 5 categories: white, black, Hispanic, other, and unknown. So I was used to going into the Hispanic category because that's what they call it. So I would look in there. One day by accident, I think I stumbled onto the unknown category. And I saw Garcia, Lopez, Sanchez. And I go, wait a minute, how could that? Why would they be in the unknown category? They belong in that other category. And then I said, let me look at the white category. Same thing, Lopez, Sanchez, Gonzalez. And I'm like, wait a minute, something's wrong here. And then I checked the other. Now, other actually that's what they place primarily people from the Middle East, Asian Pacific, and Native. They don't have separate categories. I don't think you find a lot of Latinos in the other category, but definitely in the unknown and the white category. And it's just too many. And it's convenient. Well, I don't blame the media for this. It's literally the government. That's why I say it's their responsibility, but it's convenient because it continues the dialogues. The nation can simply see it as like, this is a problem between white and black America, when in reality it is that, but it's even bigger, much bigger. Like you said, the one that I want to continue researching, the Asian figures, those are through the roof. I had zero idea because I've been monitoring since 2014, the databases, and I had never seen that before. So I'm not sure, what the deal is. So we're going to pursue that. One of the things that we asked ourselves as a group, should we count all deaths, in custody, etc.? And everybody said yes. And now, personally, I wanted just the ones that are unjustified. But how do you determine what's unjustified when you don't have a judicial system that works? It's like I would say 99.9% impunity, both in the killings that we examine and also the Border Patrol. You can count in one hand with a finger or two to spare of police officers that are doing hard time, say 30, 40, 50 years to life. I doubt there's even 5. Personally, I think that's the actual solution. Until you see that, you're not going to see anything. No reform is going to fix anything because all the cop has to say is, I feared for my life, and that absolves everything.
I also wanted to bring into this conversation, Roberto Rodriguez, Marissa Barrera. She became an advocate against police violence after police in Woodland, California, killed her brother Michael in 2017. She's the founder of the nonprofit Voices of Strength, which works with the families of other victims killed by police. She's joining us from Sacramento, California. Marissa, welcome to Democracy Now! So sorry to hear about your brother, Michael Barrera. Tell us what happened to him in 2017.
Hello, and thank you for having me this morning. In 2017, my brother, he was murdered by police in our hometown. The details are still not all clear, but we do know, and this is through physical evidence and and audio, video, pictures now at this point, that he was, before being killed by police, he was assaulted in his home by unknown assailants. And just moments later, he was murdered by multiple officers. And he was killed in a similar way to George Floyd. He had 5 officers on top of him. And the struggle lasted moments. He had the taser used on him excessively, according to their own policies. And he was being beaten, and he was ultimately suffocated to death. He had a knee in his back. There is question whether he had 2 knees from this officer who was sitting on his back, who is over 250 pounds. My brother was saying, "I can't breathe." He was struggling. He was asking for help. We don't know who assaulted him in his house, but we have reason to believe that it had to do with the police for the fact of the way he was murdered. He was unarmed. He was not posing a threat to these officers. And he was telling them he was not a threat and asking them why they were trying to kill him, as they already had guns and stuff, and they were rounding up on him. So we do have reason to believe that they were involved in some way, as my brother was speaking on things going on in the community, such as missing people and missing teenagers, just days before he was murdered this way. We do have the video evidence. We do have the audio. We have the damages done to his body. But just after this happened, they covered it up. They put a false narrative on him to make him look like he was this criminal who was out there trying to harm people and trying to kill the police. That really set the tone for what happened to my family.
I wanted to ask you specifically, what were you initially told by authorities had happened? What was their initial account to you?
So I do want to say we were not informed by the police of my brother's murder. We found out by an acquaintance in town who was at the hospital. We arrived. They were refusing to let my family in with my brother. They were refusing to let my mother see my brother in his final moments. He was already deceased, but he was 2 doors down from us, and they had police blocking us. At that point, they just told us that he was found dead in somebody's yard. There was some kind of altercation. I found out by going to his home and finding police blocking off his home where he was not killed, that police had killed him. So just fast forward that day, we were told by the sergeant of Woodland PD, Sergeant Guthrie, that my brother was in some kind of fight, a struggle with multiple cops, that he was running from cops. It was a foot chase, that he was unarmed, and he was killed. 15 minutes later, Woodland PD released into our local news, the Daily Democrat, that my brother had multiple weapons, that he had a golf club, a chef's knife, scissors, that he was naked in a trench coat, that he was breaking into cars, and that he was charging and attacking officers. They said so many horrible things about my brother. Only 15 minutes after they told my family to our face that he was an unarmed man who was killed by multiple officers, and they didn't know why.
We're talking to Marisa Barrera, founder of the nonprofit Voices of Strength. Marisa, tell us what you are demanding now.
So what we are demanding now, fast forward 4 years later, so many facts and truth have came out. All that I shared with the first narrative was not true. My brother was dressed. He was assaulted in his home before cops, and he did not assault them. And I've seen the video. I've heard the audio. So we want full transparency. We want his case reopened. But right now, with everything going on in the country and police killings being brought to light, and we are asking with other families that all of our cases be opened, because there is so much corruption, so much horrible things behind all of our killings. So that is why I work with the other families as well, because it's happening to all of us. How bad my brother's story is, which I just shared a piece of it, it's horrible. But all the other families that I work with, they have similar stories, just as bad. Just we have our own just unique twist to it, but ultimately we go through the same things.
And I'd like to bring Roberto Rodriguez back into the conversation. Roberto, yes. This whole issue of reform, there's been all this talk now in the past year since the death of George Floyd about ways to reform or even defund the police. You have a long history in dealing with police abuse. What is your sense of where these calls for reform or transformation of policing are going to go?
Yeah, well, I'm in full support of all of that. The problem, what I'm saying is that if an officer simply says they were in fear for their life, none of those reforms are going to help. But that doesn't mean you stop. Everything that you can do is kind of like body cameras. That was not happening before. Accountability project, et cetera. All that stuff there's a number of things that have happened, a number of reforms, and they're all good. I personally, I mentioned a second ago, 30, 40, 50 years to life, that's the only thing that's going to stop this. However, one of the things that we're doing as part of the project is looking at going to the International Criminal Court at the UN and the OAS version also. We've gone to the UN before, the Convention on Racism. We know they're racist. It's not enough. It's got to go to the criminal level where they hunt down Nazis 70 years after the fact. Marisa just mentioned families. All killings have no statute of limitation. That's why you're able to hunt down people. And what Marisa said is accurate. Every single family has a story, and they're powerful, and they have to live and relive, and it's inhumane, So I personally think that anybody that comes up with a reform and can pass one, great, but we can't stop there. We have to continue, transparency, access to videos, everything. When the cameras started happening, people said, oh, it's going to be over now. But all the killings that we're talking about, how many prosecutions? I had to watch probably over 1,000 videos to do my book, the Yolki book. And I can tell you, it doesn't really matter. You can see it, and then they'll say, you didn't see what happened before. Or they'll say, you didn't see what happened afterwards. There's a man out of Bakersfield, Francisco Serna, who was killed. They thought he had a weapon, and they found a crucifix on him. Francisco Serna. There was a Daniel Covarrubias out of the state of Washington who was killed carrying a cell phone. You know who he was? The great-grandson of Chief Joseph. That cell phone, right? That, to me, that's the scariest thing, even scarier than a crucifix. You know why? Because everyone has a cell phone. So if they want to claim that I saw a shiny object, and they're going to find a cell phone on pretty much everybody, the problem is not police by themselves. It's the judicial system, and it's the politicians that are cowardly, that will not step forward. It's our society as a whole. I don't have to tell you. You cover this every single day. We live in a society, based on those that have and those that don't, So basically I look at it like those that are considered human, those of us that are not considered human. And you're right. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to thank you very much for being with us and say that we want to have you back on when you have your final report. Roberto Rodriguez is the director of the Raza Database Project, which just published the preliminary report titled Deaths of People of Color by Law Enforcement Are Severely Undercounted. Roberto Rodriguez is a professor at the University of Arizona, author of several books, including Yolki, a warrior summoned from the spirit world, testimonials on violence, on police violence in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Also the book Justice, A Question of Race, where Roberto Rodriguez details his own experience after a brutal beating at the hands of LA sheriffs in March of 1979. And we want to thank Marisa Barrera, founder of the nonprofit Voices of Strength, who works with families of other victims killed by police. Her own brother, Michael Barrera, was killed by Woodland, California police in February of 2017. Coming up, we go to Canada, where the bodies of 215 children have been found on the grounds of a former residential school where Indigenous children were sent after being forcibly separated from their families. Stay with us. What Child Is This by throat singer duo Pilksuk. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. The Canadian government is facing pressure to declare a national day of mourning after the bodies of 215 children were found in British Columbia on the grounds of a school where Indigenous children were sent after being forcibly separated from their families by the Canadian government. The bodies were discovered at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which opened in 1890 and closed in the late 1970s. The Catholic Church ran the school up until 1969. Over a span of a century, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were sent away from their families as part of an effort by the government and church to rid them of their native cultures and languages. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada concluded that the residential schools were, quote, an integral part of conscious policy of cultural genocide against Canada's First Nations population. The commission estimated 4,100 children died while attending residential schools across Canada. The commission's findings prompted a new search for unmarked graves at residential schools. This is Chief Roseanne Casimir of the Kamloops First Nation.
Knowing that, children have went missing, their relations have went missing, that and never came home. There was always questions of where, and, there had to be more to the story than, they ran away or, what other reason that they may have, given. So I do know that with this here find, it's about bringing in, the advanced technology today to be able to, look beneath the surface of the soils and to, confirm some of the stories that were once told.
We're joined now by Cindy Blackstock, Gitxsan activist for child welfare and executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, also a professor at McGill University. She's joining us from Ottawa. We thank you so much for joining us, Professor Blackstock. Talk about this horrific finding.
You know what we know is that First Nations, Métis and Inuit children were dying at prolific rates, often related to the federal government's underfunding of the schools in terms of health care and bad health practices like putting sick kids in with healthy kids, malnourishment, etc., and abuse and neglect. And the federal government knew about this in 1907, had the remedies to address it, and chose not to do it. And this is a history that we see replaying itself throughout the entire history of residential schools. These stories of children dying under these dreadful circumstances were repeated, and Canada continued to do nothing to help them. And so the important thing to know here is that these children are just some of the children who died in the schools. There are many others in unmarked graves across the country.
And Professor Blackstock, could you talk about the role of the Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau at this time, and in terms of these revelations? Isn't the Canadian government still actively litigating against residential school survivors?
Yeah, they are. Despite the Prime Minister accepting all of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action back in 2015, his government is not only litigating against residential school survivors, the survivors from St. Anne's residential schools, where there was actually an electric chair. They would literally put children in an electric chair and shock them. And Canada is litigating against the survivors because it doesn't want to provide them proper justice and compensation. But it's also litigating against this generation of First Nations children. In 2016, we have a legal ruling that found that the government of Canada is racially discriminating against over 165,000 children by providing unequal federal services on reserves. And these are public services that children need. And that inequality, it was linked to the unnecessary family separations of thousands of children, in fact, in greater numbers than in residential schools, harms to children, and indeed, in some tragic cases, the deaths of children. And yet, Canada, we've had to have 19 procedural and noncompliance orders against this government to try and get them to a place to stop the discrimination. And we're going back to court in 2 more weeks.
Professor, I wanted to ask you specifically at this place, describe this school so people have a sense. So often you learn a story and you learn about the whole world of what you believe happened to these hundreds of children.
Yeah, one of the important things that your listeners may want to know is that our residential school system was actually based off of a model in Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania. We sent one of our emissaries, John A. Macdonald, our first prime minister, did down there, and he modeled our residential schools after that. So it's important to know that these stories are probably going to unfold in the United States as well, with the tragic loss of life of Native Americans. This particular school is actually right in the middle of a city called Kamloops, which has a population of roughly about 125,000 people. The school sits in beside a river. And on one side of the river is a large settlement, and on the other side is the other half of the city. So people would have literally driven past this. And this school was set up in the 1870s and operated until the 1970s. And there are other schools across the country, 130 of them. And some of them were still operating as late as 1996. We don't know
how
why.
Is it possible? How is it possible for the burial sites to be hidden for so long from public knowledge? And could you talk about the role of the church in this and what you think the church needs to do to atone for these atrocities?
Right. So what we have is really that these deaths would be hidden purposefully by the church and by the government of Canada. We know that when the chief medical health officer of the Indian Department raised the alarm about the unequal health care funding in 1907, resulting in the deaths of so many children, that the government of Canada actually cut all of his research funding to document the death rates, and they persecuted him. So we have a situation where the children would die sometimes of preventable disease, but in the cases of maltreatment and include indeed murder, there was a real incentive for those who had done the harm to just bury the kids and not notify anyone. In fact, we have many stories where the other children in the school, if you can imagine, were forced to dig the graves of the children who had died from these various types of maltreatment. So it's going to be very important to determine the cause of death. In terms of the churches, the Catholic Church ran this. And we know around the world there has been a lot of scandals about sexual abuse done by priests and other members of the clergy. In this particular case, the Catholic Church was running residential schools all over Canada, including the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And the Catholic Church has really not stepped forward since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There was a call to action for the Pope to apologize, for the church to provide restitution to the victims of its work. And then the third piece is to disclose all the records. It took a lot of the records on residential schools, including who the children were and what happened to them, back to the Vatican, where they were out of reach of residential school survivors who wanted to know the truth and have some source of justice based on those documents. But they're still in the Vatican, so those need to be returned.
We're going to continue to follow this. Cindy Blackstock, Gixon activist for child welfare and executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, also a professor at McGill University. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Produced with Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Renee Feltz, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Tiersena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Trina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Marie Astudio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Masood, Adriana Contreras, our general manager, Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Miriam Barnard, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grand, Dennis Moynihan, David Pruden, Dennis McCormick. Tomorrow on Democracy Now!, we will look at the connection of domestic abuse, and mass killings. On Thursday, Carol Anderson, the second Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.